cancel means to remove something's power or value. A cancelled check, a cancelled appointment. So what does it mean to cancel a person? In our culture, individuals can be publicly called out on social media, uninvited, no platformed, socially excommunicated for their actions, words or blunders. Seen as a form of online justice, a grassroots way to hold the powerful accountable and police influencers. Should Christians participate in cancel culture? Are there ever actions so bad that they shouldn't be forgiven? Christians are keen to stand up for justice, but should we be known instead for our mercy? What is the role of forgiveness in acting mercifully? And how do mercy and wisdom go together so that we don't become doormats? This is an inspiring interview with Natalie Williams, the author of 'Tis Mercy All, and she's the director of Jubilee Plus, a charity that equips churches to change the lives of people in poverty. Trigger warning, we discuss instances of sexual abuse in the church, so do be conscious of who is listening around you and your own sensitivities. I'm Melanie Cave. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast. Here we go. Hello, welcome Natalie to the Roots for Churches podcast. I'm delighted to have you here. We're talking about mercy today, and we'll touch on cancel culture and forgiveness and what it looks like to really put mercy into action. You've written a book on this subject, but I just want to know what's the story behind why is mercy so important to you?
Well, I think, first of all, because I've experienced so much of it from God in my own life. Yeah, I grew up in relative poverty, lived on the 16th floor of a block of council flats with no central heating, free school meals, all that sort of thing, and from a very working class background as well. And then at the age of 15, I started going to church because I liked a boy. So I wasn't looking for Jesus. I wasn't looking for faith. In fact, I was quite a zealous atheist, but I was one of those atheists who has a very clear idea of the God I don't believe in and what he's like. And I even tried to persuade Christians around me at the time that they should become atheists too. So I was like an evangelist for atheism. But God really just grabbed hold of me in a way that was very unexpected, and then started to turn my life around. So lifting me out of all types of poverty, spiritual, economic, relational, aspirational as well, actually. And my aspirations changed. That was probably the first thing that changed. But I didn't really feel comfortable in church. I didn't really feel like I fitted in. And so then I really went off the rails because I thought, well, if I don't fit in with the people of God, then God can't really want me. And so I really threw myself into partying and boys, drugs, drink, and spent 6 or 7 years really trying to look for anything else that would satisfy, and feeling like I'd completely blown it with God and that there was no way back. And then, incredibly, it turns out there was a way back. And so just God's mercy on me in saving me in the first place, but then in my journey's been very volatile, very up and down. My background's very broken and chaotic. And I look back at my life, and there's one way to look at it, which is it's been mess after mess after mess. Periods of backsliding or going off the rails or being lukewarm in my heart and going through the motions, but internally being like, I'm not even that interested in Jesus right now. And the other way to look back at my life is to see it as mercy after mercy after mercy. And I feel like that's the way God looks at it, and that's what God has done. So my own testimony has been the mercy of God really is new every single day, like Lamentations says. And so I'm passionate about it because I've experienced so much of it.
No, I think in church we can be a bit self-righteous. We can, although we say that we're saved by grace, and we like to think of ourselves as good people, and generally people who do good to others but aren't really in need of mercy ourselves. And I think recognizing our need for mercy is possibly part of this journey, is it not?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think for me, I feel like the longer I've been a Christian now 30 years, and I feel like the longer I've been a Christian, just the more aware of my sinfulness I've become. And I wonder if I just knew that, if it would utterly crush me. But actually, because God is kind, because he's tender-hearted, because he's merciful, I feel like I've just had this ongoing and deepening revelation that my sin is no match for his mercy. And that's one of the lines in the book. It's one of my favourite lines, because when I wrote it, I suddenly was hit by it again. Like, wow, my sin, including my sin of self-righteousness, including the times when I think, well, I'm better than that person, and I'm better. At least I'm not as bad as that person. You know, the very sins of the Pharisees that Jesus called out. And I so often like to associate myself with Peter or John or the disciples, but actually rarely think, well, actually, I think I'm just like the Pharisees. But I think I am actually. More and more, I'm like, oh, the closer I get to God, in some ways, I see my own sinfulness more clearly, but I also feel better about myself. And then it's kind of like this loop of continually needing revelation of, oh no, I was an enemy of God. And apart from the grace of God, I'm the worst of sinners, like Paul says. But actually, thanks to his mercy, thanks to his grace, I'm welcomed in, I'm accepted, even though he knows my heart, he knows my motives, he knows, every evil thought, every wicked deed, and whether other people would think, oh, that's truly evil, or just, oh, that's not that bad. Actually, I think compared to the holiness of God, all of it is like filthy rags, isn't it? So with that revelation of sinfulness, I think comes this beautiful accompanying revelation of the wonderful mercy of God that says, actually, I see you exactly as you are. I know your sinfulness more than you know it. I see all the thoughts, all the motives, all the deeds that you can even lie to yourself about, or give yourself all these mitigating circumstances and say, yeah, but I only did that because, or, oh, but I didn't mean to do that, or I didn't mean to hurt you like that. God sees it all. He knows it all completely. And his response to me is to say, my mercies are new for you every day, that he is rich in mercy, that he is abundant in mercy. It says in Psalm 51, where David is repenting of his adultery and murder. He's not saying, have mercy on me because I didn't really mean it, or because it was just a lapse in judgment, or because it was out of character, or because most of the time I'm righteous, God, and because I'll really make it up to you, or I'll do some penance, or whatever it is. He says, have mercy on me according to your abundant mercy, according to your steadfast love. It's all because of him and who he is. And so as you grasp that, I think you become more aware of your sin, but it doesn't crush you. I think that's been my experience.
Because is there something about our culture, like all those sort of ways that we defend ourselves, we mitigate, we kind of defend, apologize, explain away? I think our culture really is anxious about guilt. It's anxious about admitting failure. And for a lot of us, we really like to highlight others' failures and others' unforgivable sins and how we're better than them. And our culture really doesn't want to embrace mercy. We see mercy as something weak or something a bit wet, or people who don't value justice enough. And although it's a nice word in church, I still think the church has actually held on a little bit to that cultural thing of like mercy's not really right. Like you have either justice or mercy, and we can't let go of justice. So we can't really have mercy.
And actually, I think this is something that's supposed to be distinctive about the Christian faith and the gospel, is that actually in the cross, we see mercy and justice come together perfectly. We don't see justice at the expense of mercy, or mercy at the expense of justice. We see both beautifully entwined and held together. And I feel like that's something that we don't see in the world around us, because like you said, we want justice, we don't want mercy. But the really interesting thing I find at work in my own heart, and I think this is in all of us if we're honest, is I want mercy when I'm in the wrong, but I want justice when I've been wronged. So if I hurt you, I'm going to be really quick to explain to you why I didn't mean it. I might be quick to apologise, but I'll also give you my extenuating circumstances. I'll explain what type of day I was having, or week I was having, or that you triggered something from my past, or that, I don't know, there were any number of reasons why it's not as bad what I did to you, but you can do the very same thing to me. And I want justice. I want you to be, not only to be sorry, but to prove you're sorry, and to have this kind of period of penance. I often think about the story of the prodigal son, and, the father runs, and I think I wouldn't have run. I'd have sat there and waited to see if he was truly sorry, or if he was just hungry. Because actually we're told he was starving to death, and his motive seems to be food. And I for sure know that when I'm hungry enough, I'll apologise about anything, but the father doesn't sit there with his arms folded, kind of tutting, waiting to see. And I think if it was me, I'd be like, you definitely need a period of time on the naughty step, don't you? Or the adult version of the naughty step. You need to prove you're truly sorry, that you've seen the error of your ways, that you're not going to do it again. And that's what I want for you when you wrong me. I want you to prove your apology. But for me, I just want you to forgive me quickly if I've hurt you. And I feel like we see that across our whole culture. We see people piling on to cancel celebrities, politicians, whoever it might be. But we also do that from the comfort of armchairs where we don't actually know the people. I have this running joke with my mum. She talks about the royal family as if she's best mates with them. Like, she gives motives to each one, sometimes good, sometimes bad, depending on what she thinks. And I often will turn around to her and say, so when you were chatting with, Prince Harry, it might be, is that what he said to you? And we often just muck around about it. But the truth is, we see this at work in our own hearts all the time, don't we? We come with biases, with preconceived ideas. And even, I mentioned the royal family. If I mention a specific member of the royal family, depending on your thoughts and your experiences and what you've read and what maybe you've gone through yourself, your reaction to one member of the royal family might be no smoke without fire. But your reaction to another member of the royal family might be, oh, no, they're just trying to look out for their family. And I see that, celebrities, I think about, Philip Schofield, for example. I didn't feel much sympathy for him, if I'm honest, initially. And then when first some stuff came out about Hugh Edwards, when it initially did and we didn't know the full extent of it, I did feel sympathy for him. And I thought, what's the difference there? I don't know either of these guys. It's just based on my own issues, my own stuff, my own preconceived ideas. And so I want justice sometimes, I want mercy at other times. And it very much is fickle and volatile and not really grounded in any sort of reality. And we see it play out in our lives. I've had a friend who cheated on her husband. And I could give you all the reasons why that happened, why it wasn't really her fault. But I've also, I've talked to someone about that. And then the same day, someone has mentioned someone else who got cheated on. And I've said, there's no excuse ever for cheating. We are hypocrites a lot of the time, if we're honest. And our motives aren't pure. They're not faultless. I think what we see in culture play out all the time is this baying for blood when we feel like it, or when that particular public person doesn't feel like they deserve our mercy. But other times we'll be very forgiving, very understanding. If we really like the person, or we like their music or their films or whatever it might be, then we have a totally different approach. But I think we don't see this clearly about ourselves, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah. So with cancel culture, this idea that you write someone off because they have stepped over some line, some moral outrage that we've decided they have failed. And often these people are sort of scapegoats in a culture where a lot of this is going on, and that person gets held up. And actually, if we cancel them, they'll be a lesson to everybody. And we'll all know not to do that. And I'm not sure it works. Everybody has a strong opinion about it, and everybody wades in, as you say, from their armchairs. Should Christians participate in cancel culture? Is this helpful for us? Is there something about being moral guardians of our culture that means that we should say these things are wrong, but then also by saying things are unforgivable? Isn't that kind of anti-Christian?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think that as Christians, we should participate, but in a different way to the way the world participates. So I don't think Jesus allows us to ever write someone off entirely. I just don't see how, biblically speaking, we can argue that we're allowed to do that. If we're reading the Gospels, if we're looking, that's exactly what the Pharisees did, isn't it? They said that person's unclean, or don't you know who that woman is or what she's done? And they were constantly looking to throw stones, literally and metaphorically, and Jesus didn't do it. And if anyone could have done it, he could have done it, but he didn't do it. And he actually even said to the Pharisees, you're putting heavy burdens on people and slamming the door of heaven in their faces. He says, you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, which is justice, mercy, and faithfulness. But interestingly, that's justice and mercy, again, together, there, not one or the other. So I think the way that Christians can participate in cancel culture is by holding justice up highly and holding mercy up highly, and saying, actually, showing mercy doesn't diminish the harm that's been caused. Showing mercy doesn't say that behavior was okay. In fact, in order for it to be mercy, it has to be saying that behavior isn't okay. What you did isn't okay. Mercy is never deserved. That's the whole concept of mercy, isn't it? That it's never something you deserve. So the very act of showing mercy is saying, you don't deserve this from me, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so for Christians, I think there's this distinctive space that we can occupy. Sadly, we don't a lot of the time, but I think it's something we can and should aspire to, where we call out sin, where we want righteousness, where we say categorically that behavior, that thing that's been done is wrong. It's offensive to God. Even calling it sin, it's funny, isn't it? Because even with cancel culture, saying to someone you've sinned is still offensive, isn't it? But we do it all the time, just with different language. But, to be able to say that is wrong, but I still want redemption for you. I still want restoration. I still believe that, because that's kind of the point of biblical justice, is that biblical justice doesn't say you're cancelled, it's done, it's over. Biblical justice actually longs and works for your repentance, your genuine sorrow over your sin, so that you can then be redeemed, restored, reconciled, maybe not restored to the role you had before. It's not about restored to the outward stuff, but it's about an acceptance that you can know deep in your soul and heart and mind that actually you've not been written off, you've not been cancelled. And actually, I love the fact that the only thing that seems to get cancelled in the gospel is when you come and you put your faith in Jesus Christ, it says he's cancelled the record of debt against you. So there's a biblical cancel culture, but it's very different to the world's cancel culture. But I feel like for us, we're in danger of going with society and saying justice, this form of justice, which says you wrecked it, you've blown it, you're done, you're out, you're cancelled, you're done. That's not biblical justice. Biblical justice is purer and higher and richer and deeper than that, because biblical justice says what you did was truly awful and wrong and unspeakable sometimes too, but that if you repent, if you are brought to a place of sorrow for your sins, which actually is the goal of justice, that then there can be these things: redemption, restoration, reconciliation, or some form of them in some ways.
It does seem that the cancel culture, it separates us and it puts this distance between us and whoever that is, so that relational thing is not there, so that people can't be redeemed. The conversation, the relationship isn't there. So how could they possibly repent or change? There's so much shame heaped on them, and they're so isolated by being scapegoated and sent away, that it's more likely that they'll think, oh, everybody hates me, I'll just go off or hide. Yeah. How do we hold justice and relationship when in some of these situations it is brutal, it's awful? These could be abuse, these could be violence, these could be situations that feel quite dangerous, and just people who are stuck in patterns of really unhelpful behavior, unhealthy things for them and others. What does mercy look like to offer to people when they've done things that are really difficult and horrendous relationally?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things here is that often we think that mercy and wisdom are at odds with each other. But in James's letter, he describes what wisdom from above looks like. And one of the things it says is that it's full of mercy. And so wisdom and mercy aren't at odds. We're supposed to, a bit like mercy and justice, hold these things together in tension often, but actually in harmony when we are really looking at Jesus and how does he do these things. So we definitely need wisdom. I've wrestled with this question myself. The person who led me to Jesus is a convicted paedophile now. And that was devastating for so many people. Of course, the victim, first and foremost, the victim and the victim's family and the ripple effect. But the ripple effect spread through more than one nation, actually, in churches in more than one nation, of all the people who had been either led to Jesus by this guy or brought closer to Jesus by this guy, because you question everything. So for me, I was like, are the whole foundations of my faith illegitimized by what this guy's done? And who is he? Because I thought he was this godly guy who, if you'd asked me before it happened, who do you know who loves Jesus the most, who's the most zealous and passionate and fervent about the Lord, I'd have said this guy. And then you find out that actually for 2 years behind the scenes, secretly, he's been abusing someone in his church, and he went to prison. But I have wrestled with this question for a long time so what does it mean to show him mercy? Because actually, I feel like he would be shunned in most churches if they knew what he's done. But surely the church should be the one place where even someone who's done what most of us would consider to be the most awful thing you can do, to abuse a child, if there's no mercy in the church for someone like that, then there is no mercy anywhere, is there? So what does that look like? Because what it doesn't look like is saying, yeah, just come in and hang out with the kids. Obviously it doesn't look like that. Obviously it looks like putting in place safeguarding measures of protection for anyone and everyone who could be affected, and to be really serious about that, really wise about it, for that to be the highest priority of the safety of everyone. But actually, what does it look like? My prayer for him, he doesn't follow Jesus anymore. He's lost his faith. My prayer for him is that he would come back to God, and he would find mercy for himself in a very personal way between him and the Lord, but would also then maybe be able to share with others who've done unspeakably awful things that song we sing, the vilest offender who truly believes that moment from Jesus a pardon receives, is actually true. And not just true for the lesser evils, not just true for the sins we think are socially acceptable, like pride or greed or gluttony or lying, but even for the most repulsive of sins, the most abhorrent, the most traumatizing. So there definitely has to be a way, though, to walk that line of justice, so someone serves their time. I think part of the issue is, though, that we live under flawed justice systems, don't we? So someone can be sentenced to 2 years for something that, or 4 years or whatever, for something that I would sentence them for 20 years. And then someone else might be sentenced. We've seen this with the recent rioting, haven't we, over the summer? Some people getting sentences and some saying they're too long and prisons are overcrowded. Why are we getting such long sentences? And others saying they're too short. And it really does depend on your own, I think, experience, how much what's happened affects you personally, or people you know or are close to or care about. But our justice system is flawed in that you might get longer for throwing a bottle at a police officer during the riots than you do for abusing a child. And clearly that's not right. So there is something of Christians needing to work for proper and proportionate and appropriate justice. But at the same time, again, coming back and saying, but we're not saying there's no possibility here of repentance or redemption or restoration, or even in some cases, incredibly, mind-blowingly, reconciliation. I think when we're talking about abuse, reconciliation is almost impossible. And what I would say is reconciliation is always impossible without repentance. You can't be reconciled to someone who has not owned their mistakes, whether that's something as serious as abuse, which I don't want to really call that a mistake, or whether it's something much more low-key, like someone who's lied to you or betrayed you or gossiped about you, or these that's probably the two ends of the spectrum, isn't it? But there is something here of what does it mean for me to be wise and merciful and want justice, but I can't have reconciliation at any point if you haven't owned what you've done. If you haven't, and when I say owned it, I mean owned it without excuse, owned it without blaming other people, owned it without saying, but this happened to me and that's why. Yeah, exactly. But these things are incredibly complex and complicated, and that's like kind of the deep end of mercy, isn't it, when we're talking about things like abuse? Whereas for me, I think trying to be merciful on a day-to-day level is hard enough, let alone when we're talking about the extremes. So for me, you know, I find just in traffic, I'm not very merciful. With some of my annoying neighbours, I'm not very merciful. I find that often what comes out of my heart is a desire for vengeance, not even really justice, just wanting to get them back, wanting to pay back, wanting to, you know, don't you love it if someone overtakes you dangerously on a single carriageway, and then you catch up with them at traffic lights like 2 minutes later because you just there's this you know, I'm so glad. Or I found myself thinking, this is awful, but I found myself thinking the other day, someone was driving really badly, like really, it was a 60-mile-an-hour road and they were overtaking, really, I would have guessed probably they must have been doing about 80 miles an hour on bends, on whatever. Yeah. And I found this thought going through my head of like, oh, like, I hope they have an accident. And then I was like, what are you thinking? Because obviously I don't, well, you know, I mean, it came out my heart, so I guess I do think it. But there are things we think like that, which are so unmerciful. Yeah. And I think for ourselves, we all might know that time I've done a speed awareness course because I broke the law. and I remember the person at the start of that saying, just want you to know that you are all in fact criminals. And I was like, that's harsh, blah, blah, blah. But isn't it just, again, this whole dynamic of I've got excuses, but whatever your excuses doesn't count. And I just think I see that play out every day in my own life. And so trying to become a person of mercy, like, you know, Jesus said in Luke 6, verse 36, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. I think it's one of the hardest things Jesus said. It's so overlooked. I don't often hear people talk about that verse. For me, it's become a verse I'm trying to live by, but it's so hard. And it's so hard even on the shallow end of the spectrum, let alone when we're talking about the most serious of offences.
That's really good. And I think we like that. You reap what we sow. We like people getting their comeuppance. We probably embrace a little bit of that karma idea. Well, you know, you got what you were planting. It's grown up and bitten you now. You do what you sow is biblical. But Jesus's way is different. That he makes the sunshine on the just and the unjust. He makes the rain fall on all of us, whether we deserve it or not. And that generosity of God really challenges us. And as you say, it's very hard. It's very hard to be merciful in the big things and in the small things. What have you done, like little things, to help you embed this in your life so that it comes out of you more naturally, at least?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it starts with praying about it. And I think in also doing a deep dive into the mercy of God and being okay with talking about the extent of my sin, with an understanding of that when God does reveal that, like I said, it's not to crush me, it's to bring me to a deeper revelation of his mercy and his grace and his kindness and his love towards me. But I think as well as looking at the fact that anyone in the Bible who cries out to God in distress is shown mercy, even the most evil kings of the Old Testament, people who sacrifice their own kids, it says when they cry out to God in their distress, he's moved. I think, why? That's crazy to me, but it's because at the heart of his character, he's merciful. So I'm not being glib about the Bible reading and the praying. Those are things I have intentionally sought to do to understand the mercy of God. But then obviously it has to translate into attitudes and actions. And I think the attitudes have to come first, and that starts by being quite vigilant for where I'm not very merciful, but also having surrounded myself with people who call me out on it. So while I was writing the book on mercy, I had this guy I don't know contact me on social media and say to me, I'm reading one of your other books, but before I can go any further, I just need to clarify something. It seems to me that you are unmarried and childless and therefore cannot be following Jesus. Because if you were following Jesus, you would know that your primary call is to be married and to procreate. And I was absolutely furious. Wow. I was livid. I went from 0 to 60 in anger in a split second. And rightly so. I mean, how dare he? And I started typing all these replies, on my phone. I was like, don't you know that Jesus was single and childless? Or, how dare you? You have no idea whether this is painful for me or not, and you've just jumped right in insensitively. Or, I don't know. 1 Corinthians 7 says it's better to be single. Like, I had so many answers,
yeah.
and I kept typing and deleting and typing and deleting. And I took a screenshot of it and sent it to someone on the Jubilee Plus team who I work with, and her response was, "Lord, have mercy." And then I was really annoyed with her as well, because I was like, "Don't say that." And now
I was enjoying ranting.
Yeah. I'm enjoying ranting. The reason for sending the screenshot was so that you would jump in on my anger.
Help me out, yeah.
Not maybe point out to me in just, 3 simple words. Aren't you writing a book on mercy? Aren't you always talking about mercy? Aren't you trying to live a life of mercy? And I'm like, I want to stick my fingers in my ears and go, shut up. Why would you say that to me right now? And to be honest, that's part of the problem with writing a book on mercy and speaking on it, is that all my friends feel very free to call me out on every unmerciful reaction. It's kind of, I want to roll my eyes now, because I know I just do the slightest thing and I'm like, that's not very merciful, Nat. I've set myself up for that totally, haven't I? But so help me to not be like a Pharisee. And actually, sometimes anger is the right response, because God gets angry. Righteous anger is the right response, but God doesn't flare up in a temper about it. God doesn't, take screenshots and then send it to everyone he knows so that they'll all jump in on it with him. His anger isn't volatile or rash. It's proportional, it's measured, it's balanced, it's appropriate always. And so even recognizing sometimes anger and mercy, again, they're not at odds with each other. But so that's having people who point out my attitudes, but also wanting to be aware, wanting to come before the Lord and say, help me see where I'm not merciful. But then it has to translate to action as well. So for me, just practically speaking, I'm constantly asking God, well, what does it look like to be merciful with my money? Because I think we live in such a materialistic culture, and an attitude of mercy with my money means that I'm quick to want to give to others and be generous towards others, and not to let my first question be, but what will they do with it? Will they be wise with it? And that can be a stranger on the street, or that can be my friends as well. Like, their decision making's a bit off sometimes. Like, or I don't know if you've ever done this, where you give someone money for a particular need, and then the next thing you see that they've booked to get their nails done, or they've booked a holiday, and you think, that's weird. If you had money for that, why did you say you needed money? That we're so judgmental, aren't we? I mean, I am. I just judge, where the Bible says mercy triumphs over judgment, I think not often in my heart, if I'm honest. But yeah, so looking to be generous with money without the first question being, what will they do with it? But actually, God, what are you asking of me? And worrying more about my own heart and my own actions than someone else's, I think is really important. Because I often, if I'm walking down the street and someone's asking for money, I might think, my first thought might be, what will they do with it? Will they be wise with it? What will they spend it on? But actually, God's going to hold them accountable for that. What he's going to hold me accountable for is, was I generous? And that might look like buying a sandwich or having a conversation and getting to know someone. It might not always look like giving money, but it definitely should sometimes. So I just want to be open to that. But also possessions, sharing stuff's really, I don't know, in our materialistic culture can be so hard. I'm one of these people who, in my office at work, I lock my mug away so that no one else can use it. And for a long time I had a phone charger at work, but then people just used to borrow or steal, depending on your version of events, that charger. And I'd been known to stomp around the building accusing usually the worship leaders, to be honest, because they're trying to charge a tablet or something. And so I'd stomp around, who's got my phone charger, who's got my charger? And I remember once doing that, and a friend of mine was following me because she was trying to have a really serious conversation with me about something going on in her life. But I was so preoccupied with that I might not get this charger back. And at one point, she just put her hand on my shoulder to stop me in my tracks and was like, hey, can you listen to me? But also, don't you talk about sharing and generosity and stuff like that? And I'm like, again, just what does it look like for me to not be so obsessed with my phone charger? Because actually, at the end of the day, it's a first world problem, isn't it? That someone's nicked it. And so there's possessions and thinking about what I do with my stuff. But I'm also thinking, what does it look like to be merciful with my time? And I think we're in a culture where a lot of times messages on social media will tell us, don't spend time with people who drain you. Only spend time with people who energize you. But if everyone only spends time with people who energize them, then who's ever spending time with the people who are draining? Who's ever showing them mercy and compassion? And, I don't know if you have this, but sometimes in church, in the tea and coffee time, you see someone head towards you and you just try and get out of their line of sight because you don't want to get stuck with them. You know that it might be an awkward conversation or they might go on forever and you'll never get away from them again. And I just keep hearing like this, I think the gentle whisper of the Holy Spirit saying to me, like, it's just an inconvenience to you, so get over yourself. Yeah. Like, what would it look like for you to just spend half an hour with someone you rather only spend 1 minute with? Like, just you're not that important. You're not that, I don't know I don't know if it's an importance thing or what it is, but just get over yourself a little bit and give your time to someone where it might be draining, but that's all right. Then go and spend some time with someone who energizes you next. Like, I feel like we're so... self-care is important, but it's become such a my self-care is all important, and therefore I need to only spend time with people who replenish me, and I need to only spend my money on things that do myself good. And you take care of yourself. And then often people talk about that kind of oxygen mask analogy, and I agree with that. We do need to take care of ourselves, and I'm not advocating no self-care. But I guess, like all things, we can just go from one extreme to the other. And I feel like God wants us to walk like a different path, which is my self-care is important. So God tells me to take a Sabbath rest. That's important. But I can bang on about, I need to only spend time with people who replenish me. And often the reason that's the case is because I haven't taken my Sabbath.
Yeah.
So it's like funny.
Because we live without margin. So we live without margin relationally. We work really hard. We've crammed all these things in. We've got to go to the gym. We've got to pick up children from this, that, and the other. I don't have time to stop and talk to this draining person. Or we've spent all our money or put it into savings or investing it. Or it's all allocated. I don't have money to share with this person. Yeah. And as you say, like, we'd have more if we Sabbathed, if we live with margin. We would have a bit more capacity for those who are a bit more needing our mercy, our time, our money. But so that whole thing of like, well, I have to self-care, it's because there's no margin, there's no Sabbath, there's no savings pot, there's no generosity fund. We're just relentless. And then, yes, it is a gas mask sort of situation, like desperate. And we're so beyond ourselves that we really don't have anything. But I think that's part of the danger of the way our society and as Christians, we're just running on fumes. And then mercy feels like too much of an ask. So maybe that question of like, how do we back up a bit so we can stop and have that 30-minute conversation? I think some of us, it feels like it's too much, but that's because we haven't created enough margin to allow for that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the key thing with all of this is to just be intentional. So if you currently are like, do you know what, I'm so burnt out from life and everything I'm doing, then don't start with thinking I now need to spend an evening with someone who's very draining. Start with, is there a family member who's maybe like the black sheep of the family who you can call once a week for 10 minutes to just have a conversation with, or send a text message even? Is there someone you can reach out to? Is there someone who's lonely and isolated in your church who might go the whole week without speaking to another human being, maybe because they can't get out or whatever? And you could be the person who just says, do you know what, I'm going to give 10 minutes every week, just faithfully, to phoning that person. And do you know, the funny thing about this is we all struggle with this stuff. I have got a teenager that I meet up with to support, and last time I saw her, she was so full of attitude. So, I mean, she reminded me of me when I was a teenager. I feel like this is God's sense of humour. But, you know, she was so aggressive. And I've been meeting up with her all year and just thinking, is this doing any good? Like, I'm not sure it's bringing any change. I'm not sure it's helping in any way. And then I was kind of sitting there thinking, Lord, do I have your permission to basically drop this person? And she'd been out vaping and she came back in and she said, oh, yeah, like, I'm reading your book about mercy, by the way. She's not a Christian. And I was like, what? And she went, well, you gave it to me. And I was like, well, yeah, I gave it to you. I didn't know you'd read it. And she's like, oh, no, I couldn't put it down at first. She's like, it's good. She's like, I'm so proud of you. I was like, what? Like, and in that moment, I just felt God's very gentle but very firm rebuke. And just like God saying, you don't know what I'm doing. Your investment of time in this person, it feels costly to you in some ways, but it's actually not that big a deal in the grand scheme of your life. And it's one thing I'm asking you to do. I mean, God asked me to do more than one thing, but do you know what I mean? I kind of just felt God's perspective suddenly looming larger than my own perspective, which has been, this is a bit of a pain. This doesn't seem to be going anywhere. I can't see any fruit from it. But also then, as I dropped her home that same day, she was very quickly like, so when am I seeing you again? And she's like, I like the fact that when you pick me up, you don't even need to ask where we're going. You just know I want to go to McDonald's. And she's like, I like that you know that now and you don't have to ask. And I'm just like, wow. I suddenly am like, oh, okay, God, this little act of mercy, which is a very, very small thing for me, but sometimes feels much bigger than it is, actually maybe planting seeds so deep that I have no idea what the impact is going to be. And maybe I'll never get to know in this life, but actually, just again, it's just not as big a thing, is it? So sometimes it's just that intentionality, and it's just trying to get God's perspective, and it's trying to go, this isn't that disruptive to my life anyway. Like, I'm not some big martyr because I'm doing, do you know what I mean? And but also then having to deal with the self-righteousness that comes from, I'm such a good person because I'm spending time, like, you know, I feel like everywhere we turn, there's a fresh opportunity to go, oh, okay, God, I'm not that merciful. Or even when I am, I then feel so good about it that I'm like, I don't know, just sinning in a different way. But I think the key thing is, what does it look like for us to have a kingdom perspective with our money, with our time, with our possessions, with our work, with our families? Often it's hardest in our families, isn't it? Because my working life is involved in poverty, and obviously that's my background, as I mentioned. I'm struck by Isaiah 58, where it talks about, you know, what's true fasting, and it's loosing the bonds of injustice, and it's feeding the hungry, and it's bringing the homeless into your own home, and it's pretty radical. But then nestled in the middle of all that, it says it's not withholding yourself from your own flesh. And I think so often in our families, it's hardest to work this out because there's that family member who's really hurt us, or the one who's really cantankerous and grumpy and no fun to be around. And, you know, or there's the one who's just, I don't know, maybe got the completely opposite faith views or political views to us, and we can't see them for 5 minutes without getting into some big argument about the state of the nation. Or, do you know what I mean? Like, you know, often where the rubber hits the road with mercy is, will I intentionally even make an effort with that family member who, if I wasn't a Christian, I'd probably never speak to again.
Yeah. So can you give me a short definition of mercy? Because it feels like it becomes bigger and bigger the more you talk about it. And what am I trying to offer somebody when I offer them mercy?
I think essentially mercy is doing good to someone who doesn't deserve it. That's probably, in a nutshell, it's loving kindness in action towards someone who's got no right to it, no claim on it, no reason they should expect it from you. It's also the opposite of karma. So karma says you get what you deserve. And I know, you know, we've touched on you reap what you sow, and that is a biblical concept. But also mercy is a biblical concept too. So those two things work in tension. But mercy is not karma. Mercy is actually you get the good that you don't deserve. I opened the book "'Tis Mercy All" with the story of a friend of mine who died in a traffic accident, and the driver who killed her was arrested for causing death by dangerous driving. And a judge said to him, you know, I need to warn you, when we come back for sentencing, you're going to go to prison. You're facing a custodial sentence. And my friend's parents wrote to the judge after he said that, before the sentencing day, and said, please don't send the guy who killed our daughter to prison. We're Christians. We want you to have mercy. And so the judge did. And the judge said, I'm not going to send you to prison. There were still consequences. He lost his driving license, which actually meant he lost his livelihood. So there was justice of a form, but there was also mercy, because my friend's parents asked for there to be mercy. And that guy had no right to expect it. He had no claim on it. He he couldn't have stood in court and said, you should be lenient towards me. And he didn't. He pled guilty and he accepted, it was his fault. But they didn't have to show mercy just because he pled guilty. And in fact, many of us wouldn't have. But they did. And the reason they did is because they're so acquainted with the mercy of God in their own lives that they wanted to show that mercy, even to the guy who killed their daughter. I think that kind of mercy is astonishing and rare and powerful. But I wonder if among Christians it perhaps shouldn't be as rare as it is.
So what can we do as churches to kind of reprioritize mercy in our discipleship or put it back on the agenda? Because as you say, our culture is, and churches rightly so, are championing justice. But it feels like mercy often gets sort of, we talk about forgiveness, definitely being forgiven, and we champion that. But mercy, I feel like, gets dropped a bit lower. So how can we bring it back up? What can churches do?
I think we should first of all see that mercy isn't the opposite to justice, but in the gospel there is this beautiful intermingling of the two, and that's something that I feel is distinctively Christian that we can bring. But so we need to ask ourselves, well, what would it look like here to bring both justice and mercy? And that's a hard question. It's not a quick 5-minute conversation. That's a let's tease this out. Let's wrestle with it. Let's disagree about it, but with mercy towards each other as we disagree. Let's really try and work out what would holding justice and mercy together in this situation or that situation actually look like. So that's one thing. But mercy is the opposite to judgment. And actually that's where, like I said before, the Bible says mercy triumphs over judgment. So being free to call each other out when we're being really judgmental, I think is really important. And I wonder if it's something we don't do well. And partly I think it's because, like you mentioned, the fear and the guilt and the shame that we can carry. And I think cancel culture has bred that fear and shame and guilt because we're so anxious about, we know it might be one strike and you're out. Depending what you do, it could just be one strike and you're done, you're cancelled, you're out. And so we live in fear. I know that I do that as a Christian leader. I noticed when I took on the leadership of Jubilee Plus, the charity that I run, I suddenly was like consumed with this fear of failure, with this, what if I mess it up? What if I do something wrong? And there's a way to hold that that's, I think, healthy. But definitely for me at the beginning, it was not a healthy, because 6 verse 8, it's interesting, isn't it? There we're told, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And those three things are held together. It's not act justly sometimes, but other times you can love mercy, and other times you can walk humbly. God wouldn't tell us to do these things together if we couldn't do them together. So I feel like that's part of our discipleship journey, is working out, so okay, what does that look like as and when different scenarios present themselves? So I'm regularly asking myself, what does it look like to show mercy to this person in my life who maybe is someone who's hurt me more than anyone else? Or what does it look like for me to want justice here? What does it look like for me to both want justice but also leave space for their repentance or redemption? And those are really difficult questions. And like I say, they can't be answered in 5 minutes. They're ones where it's a wrestle, often with the same situation over days, weeks, sometimes months or years. And but we have to be intentional about it if we want to grow in these things.
That's so helpful. And obviously you work with Jubilee Plus, this charity that is about helping churches engage and change the lives of people in poverty, a charity that basically helps churches be more merciful, and wrestle with this idea of how do you do mercy and justice and humility together. So what resources have Jubilee Plus got that churches might want to access?
Yeah, well, really, we are all about trying to get mercy and justice in the DNA of the church, because we believe it's not an optional extra for some Christians and not others, but is a key part of being a follower of Jesus. And so we've put together a whole bunch of resources to that end. We've got our Stand in the Gap prayer resource, which helps us pray through issues of poverty and justice in the nation. And we wrote that in partnership with a whole bunch of our charity friends, from 24/7 prayer to Christians Against Poverty to Safe Families, Home for Good, and a whole bunch of others, just to help us pray meaningfully about poverty and justice issues in our nation, or to be honest, in any wealthy nation. What does it look like to pray about those things consistently? Because I don't know about you, but I find it hard to pray consistently. In my church setting, we often pray for those who volunteer in the food bank or the debt centre or what have you. And that's our prayer about poverty and justice. But this is a resource to help us really go a bit deeper and a bit more sustainably pray about these issues. But we've also got a kids curriculum. So 10 sessions for kids, 5 to 11-year-olds in Sunday school, about generosity, justice, mercy, compassion, kindness, these sorts of things. We've got an adult version of that because the person on our team wrote the kids curriculum. And then I was like, this is so good, but I think kids are going to grasp this way quicker than adults. So we better do an adult version. And we're actually bringing out the youth version for 11 to 18s at the end of this year with Youthscape, London City Mission and New Day as well. So working in partnership with others to resource the church, to also hold events, whether that's online or in person, about mercy, justice, poverty. That's what we do. We try and help churches, whether they're wealthy churches that maybe really want to do some good in their community, or whether they're churches on estates or in kind of blocks of high-rise flats like the one that I grew up in, or wherever the churches are, we've got kind of resources that are pitched at different levels to help people I guess get God's heart, or go deeper with God's heart, and then put it into practice across the whole church, not just a department of church life.
Yeah. And I think, as you say, if we can get this into our individual lives, into the way that we think and respond, then it pours out in the actions and the ways that we want to serve together. That's really, really helpful. And obviously there's your book, which is titled "'Tis Mercy All." Tell us about the title.
Yeah, so I love the hymn "And Can It Be" that has this beautiful line in it: "'Tis mercy all, immense and free, for oh my God, it found out me." And that line for me is just, I guess, the story of my life, the story of my walk with Jesus. I've even got that line tattooed on me. And so I wanted to call the book "'Tis Mercy All" because it really is based on the idea that God is always merciful, that there's no moment where he isn't. That sometimes we find that hard to understand. So one of the things there's a whole section on our objections to the mercy of God as Christians, let alone non-Christian objections. But then really concluding everything in our lives is a mercy to us, or has an opportunity. It has a chance to be turned and redeemed into mercy towards us. But then that isn't something that we're just supposed to sit back and enjoy. It's something we're supposed to then go out into the world and be the most merciful people that exist, so that the world will look at us and go, wow, there must be something about this Jesus you worship, and it should point to him. As he said, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. It's we get to imitate the Father. Isn't that just beautiful and wonderful and a kind of crazy invitation? And so, yeah, "'Tis mercy all" is my thorough conviction. But the tagline to the book is "The Power of Mercy in a Polarized World." And it feels to me like this is a point in history where social media in particular, and the connectedness globally, has made it far more possible for us to judge people we never meet, we don't know, far more possible to be unmerciful. Kind of almost feels like public floggings now take place online, don't they? And in that space. And so it feels like that the world needs to know the power of mercy because it is so polarized. And I believe that Christians are uniquely placed to bring that mercy and reflect it. So, yeah, that's the heart behind the book. But like I've said, I am trying to learn how to be more merciful. It's not a book about, here's all the wonderful ways in which I do it. Now follow my example. It's a book of, in places, real raw honesty of, look at the state of my heart. But actually, I really want to be like the Father, so I'm going to pursue that and try it. And here's some ways we can do that together.
I love that. I love the authenticity because we all need it. And I do think that vulnerability helps us examine our own hearts. So thank you for what you've shared and how you've provoked us. I know that people will go away thinking about it. They'll be checking their social media and thinking, am I being merciful here, or quick to judge? And yeah, all the provocations around finances and time. There's lots to chew on and lots of things to put into action. Thank you so much for your time, Natalie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bless you in the ministry that you're doing with Jubilee Plus.
Thank you.
You can pick up a copy of Natalie's book or read her article on mercy in our Roots Worship Together magazine, issue 136. Roots produce weekly and seasonal resources to help you lead great church. Whether you need song suggestions, Bible notes, preaching prompts, children's or youth resources, Bible studies, or stunning illustrations, we've got you covered. Follow along in the lectionary order or search our resources by Bible passage to find content to fit your church's themes. Explore our huge range of resources by taking out a 1-month free trial at rootsforchurches.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and share it with a friend. Together, we can grow. Thanks!